Imagine there were 2 hunters and 6 rabbits in the forest. To maintain ecological balance, the hunters should only kill 1 rabbit each day to fully replenish the number of rabbits. But, due to the hunters' natural human greed, they kill more than 1 rabbit, which will ultimately cause a decline in the rabbit population. This dilemma is known as the tragedy of the commons. The first notable person is William Forster Lloyd. He was a British writer in economics that first introduced the concept of the tragedy of the commons in 1833. Later on, Garrett Hardin, an American ecologist, popularized the idea through his essay in 1968. He showed the damage that innocent actions by individuals can inflict on the environment. The tragedy of the commons is a concept highlighting the conflict between individual and collective rationality. William Forster Lloyd's most famous contribution is through a parable using the setting of a herdsman and his cattle. When pasture land, or the commons, is available to all, cattle owners have a short-term interest in increasing the size of their herds. But, unchecked, the size of the herds on the commons will soon exceed its carrying capacity. The commons will be doomed by overgrazing. Here, William Forster Lloyd's answer assumed that each human exploiter of the common was guided by self-interest. At the point when the carrying capacity of the commons was fully reached, a herdsman might ask himself, should I add another animal to my herd with the interest of gaining competitive advantage? But the loss incurred by overloading the pasture would be commonized among all of the herdsmen. Because the privatized gain would exceed his share of the commonized loss, a self-seeking herdsman would add another animal to his herd, and another. And reasoning in the same way, so would all the other herdsmen. Ultimately, the common property will be ruined. The inevitability of the scenario gives the epithet tragedy. Before further expounding on other related issues, Hardin first set the foundation with 2 issues of maximalization that explain why it is impossible as an economist to try to maximize one's resources and population simultaneously. The first reason is a theoretical one. It is not mathematically possible to maximize 2 or more variables at the same time. Secondly, to live, any organism must have a source of energy or maintenance calories, energy expended for survival. To maximize energy, work calories, unnecessary energy expended for recreational activities must approach 0. Thus, maximizing population does not maximize goods.
Hardin then explains the tragedy that freedom brings in the commons. So, picture this. There is a socially stable pasture open to all. It is to be expected that each herdsman will try to keep as many cattle as possible in the commons. At this point, the inherent logic of the commons remorselessly generates tragedy. The herdsman will want to be able to maximize his benefits, so he asks, what is the utility of me adding 1 more animal to my herd? This utility has 1 negative and 1 positive component. Since there is an additional animal to the herd, the proceeds the herdsman receives from the sales is increased by 1. This is the positive utility. But because of 1 additional animal, overgrazing can occur, and resources are reduced by 1. This is the negative utility. Adding together the component partial utilities, the rational herdsman concludes that the only sensible course for him to pursue is to add another animal to his herd. But this is the conclusion reached by each and every rational herdsman sharing a commons. Therein is the tragedy. Each man is locked into a system that compels him to increase his herd without limit in a world that is limited. In a reverse way, the tragedy of the commons reappears in problems of pollution. Here it is not a question of taking something out of the commons, but of putting something in, like sewage or wastes into the water. It is because the rational man finds that his share of the cost of the waste he discharges into the commons is less than the cost of purifying his wastes before releasing them. Since this is true for everyone, We are locked into a system of fouling our own nest, so long as we behave only as independent, rational, free enterprisers. Hardin then discusses why the conscience is self-eliminating. The argument assumes that conscience, or the desire to have children, is hereditary, but only hereditary in the most general formal sense. Those who have more children will produce a larger fraction of the next generation than those with more susceptible consciences. In the context of population problem, it applies equally well to an instance in which society appeals to an individual exploiting a commons to restrain himself for the general good by means of his conscience. To make such an appeal is to set up a selective system that works towards the elimination of conscience from the race. Lastly, Hardin reveals why we need mutual coercion. To say that we mutually agree to coercion is not to say that we are required to enjoy it. We need mutual coercion because it creates temperance. For example, in a parking lot, we need not actually forbid the citizen to park as long as he wants to. We need merely to make it increasingly expensive for him to do so. Thus, it creates a hindrance to stay there for extended amounts of time. This is why taxing is such a good coercive device. We accept compulsory taxes because we recognize that voluntary taxes would favor the conscienceless. We institute and support taxes and other coercive devices to escape the horror of the commons.
The tragedy of the commons is a real issue which has major global consequences, since humans share the Earth's resources. Therefore, it is important to understand the concept, for it tackles the issue of abusing natural resources. Once a single person or group chooses to overuse resources, others would think that it is their right to do that too. This results in global issues out of control, overconsumption, and lacking resources, which affects humankind. Here are a few real-life scenarios. Firstly, panic buying in Metro Manila. During the announcement of lockdown in March, people bought more than what they needed, stocking up for personal gain. Secondly, the overuse of antibiotics. The overuse of antibiotics results to short-term gains in livestock production and in treating common illnesses. This leads to the evolution of antibiotic-resistant bacteria. Thirdly, coal companies. Coal companies provide cheap electricity for its consumers and provides profits for the owners. However, in the long term, there will be pollution from mining and burning coal across the atmosphere lasting for thousands of years. Fourthly, climate change. People, companies, and industries use operating plants, cars, fossil fuels, and other technologies which emit chemicals harmful to the ozone layer. They use processes harmful to the environment to gain profit. Here are some other examples of the tragedy of the commons. In summary, what's good for all of us is good for each of us. If one cared for others and properly tended his one cattle in the field, this leads to a steady growth for the community. However, if people were to be greedy and hoarded as much resources as they can, this will lead to a sudden scarcity of resources, unable to fully replenish. The once exponential growth will drop and cause the status of the community and the individual to be worse off than before. What can we do, or what are we doing, to help prevent this? There are three. Firstly, direct control of a common pool source. Government can regulate consumption and legally exclude people from getting certain resources. For example, imposing a limit on how much fish can be caught, or setting a limit on how many cattle can graze in a certain field. But there are also problems that arise from this: rent-seeking, principal agent, and knowledge problems. Second, private property rights. This includes converting a common pool source to a private good. For example, imposing a toll on a highway or putting tax when one dumps wastewater. Thirdly, collective solutions. or also known as cooperative collective action. Here are some examples of collective solution: limiting the use of resources to local farmers. Next, seasonal grazing. Another is crop rotation. And sanctions against overuse and misuse of resources. Another example would be letting a small community be in charge of a plot of land. In conclusion, humans form social contracts and communal agreements. They elect governments and pass laws. This is so that they can save themselves from their own greed and tendencies.